Thanks very much. I think he's going to. Can you see me there? Can you? Have you got enough light? He's going to set out. Needs light. He's going to need more light, he says. Yeah. Otherwise, it'll just be a voice in the darkness. Yes, I thank you very much all for coming out on this dark and chilly night for an introduction to alchemy and the birth of modern science. This was a talk that was commissioned by somebody for a Shakespeare festival. They wanted to know a bit about what the alchemists were doing in Shakespearean times, and they just wanted 20 minutes or half an hour, and I was just so amazed by what I found when I started looking into alchemy that it turned into this talk. We start off with a picture. This is a picture that's familiar to most people, but it's a modern version of it, and the reason why I chose it is because it's a really brilliant metaphor for what alchemy is. When you ask people what they think alchemy is in the modern day, because we're taught to think in a very limited way about our ancestors, we tend to think only about the business of turning lead into gold, which of course is a pretty important thing to be able to do, and it is a thing we'll be looking at later on. But it's most of all, alchemy is a symbol for the perfectibility of the human spirit. And we perfect the human spirit by looking out and up. We know, as above, so below, as without, so within. The alchemists really understood this, and they were looking very, very hard at their world because they understood that what was going on was probably different from what they were seeing. And this character here, you can see that he's looking out on his world. Here's his kind of the world that he's used to, and it's got houses and trees and the sun and the stars and the moon and flowers, and it's a whole paradigm, just like ours. And somehow, by experimenting with it and by looking upwards and outwards, he has revealed to himself that this is a kind of veil of illusion. And that's the kind of enlightenment that the alchemists were after. They weren't just looking out of making a bit of money on the side. They were really adventuring, and they were edge workers. They were wherever there was an edge. In these days, from probably we're talking from maybe 3,500 BC or before. These guys were on the edge. Before science arrived, we had alchemists. The meaning of the word is really unclear, and the Orthodox people say that alchemy comes from alchemia, which means art of the Black Land. Black Land, Chem, of course, is the ancient name for Egypt, and the Black Land is also Egypt. The name comes about because every year the Nile spreads a really thick, rich soil down itself as it flows right the way down through the country. And that black soil is thought to be where the name of the Black Land comes from. And art of the Black Land, alchemy is thought to have originated in Egypt. At least a lot of alchemical myth is centred around there, and it's where the knowledge originally appears to have come from. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that was where it came from originally. It's just as far back as we can see. I actually prefer the more mythical or legendary definition of alchemy, though, rather than art of the Black Land. There's a tale that in history a race of giants married spirits, and that the offspring of this marriage were, if you like, stranded or exiled in the material world. These guys, the giants that married the spirits, were called the Nephilim in the Bible, or the Watchers, those who from heaven to earth came. And the offspring of the marriage between these giants and the spirits are said to have known a lot of stuff about electricity, about chemistry, about metallurgy, about astrology, about astronomy. And it's said that in the time whilst the Watchers were not watching, their offspring spread this information through the population, just giving this knowledge to anybody and everybody that asked for it. And not only are these guys in the Bible, Clement of Alexandria, who is taken as a reliable historian, he wrote of these teachers as the masters of metallurgy, biology, magic and astrology. And this is way back this is information that comes to the Roman or these historians from the dawn of history. Tertullian described this output as the teachings of fallen angels, and it's said that this knowledge was published originally in books called Chema. So alchemy may well come from the names of these books. And I think personally that's one of the most important clues. We're going to see that the alchemists are clearly on the right lines in many, many ways. It's just they've got a slightly mistaken tweak on it. It's like they're looking at something that's come to them not fully formed from the past.
Sorry, what books did you say?
Alchemy
comes from what books?
They would have been called, books are said to have been called Chema. If you give me your
C-H-E-M-A.
C-H-E-M-A. If you give me your email address at the end, I'll email you a copy of the notes for the talk, because not everything that's in the notes, there won't be time to talk about it all. So you can have the full thing unexpurgated by email or by post.
All those sort of things that you've been saying about the teachers and the watchers is very similar to the dream and vision of the Book of Enoch.
That's exactly right, yeah. We don't have time to go into the Book of Enoch, but actually alchemy, there's a lot of alchemical stuff in Enoch, and that story is basically very similar to, well, it's thought to be part of the Anunnaki story, which we obviously don't have time to go into here. So, but you're right, it is. That's exactly where it's tied into.
You're saying the Nephilim. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's definitely that's kind of where I think alchemy comes from. Control of the economy and information has been important to all manifestations of the world management team, and as a result, a Chinese emperor forbade production of alchemical gold as long ago as 144 BC. He tried to do it throughout the whole of China. It obviously worked really well because about 40 AD another Chinese emperor also tried to ban alchemical works across the country. In our own country, Henry IV tried to prohibit all alchemical activity in Britain in the 1400s, but his successor Henry V positively encouraged the work of the alchemists in their laboratories. And it's perhaps somewhat cynically said that the reason he was doing that was because he had soldiers in the field in France, and you didn't really mind too much about the quality of the gold you paid them with, because of course you're trying to undermine the economy of the place that you're fighting in, as well as the place itself. This particular slide shows a particularly efficient manifestation of the world management team. These are Romans, the soldiers of the Emperor Diocletian, and they are burning Egyptian alchemical books and generally suppressing them, throwing them to the floor. Book burning, of course, is a major feature of history. When you look through it, you just find our books are being burnt again and again and again. But this is a way of maintaining control of information. If you want to make sure that you stay on top of a population, you make sure that if they're doing things that are giving them any kind of individual progress or inner satisfaction, you try and sit on them and prevent it. So, however we think of alchemy, it has always been a subject of huge interest to the people who are in power. As a result, alchemists kind of became used to getting themselves into a lot of trouble. And it's really good that they got used to it, because every single one of them really did have a hard time, as we're going to see, especially the ones we've chosen for this talk. This has got several characters in it. This character up here is the Elector of Saxony, and he's called Nicholas II. And this chap here is an alchemist that he's torturing. And there's basically a piece of rope up here for dislocating his shoulder. There's something going through the back of his hands here, and they're also tweaking his legs, stretching him and generally pulling him apart. These are a bunch of guys who, pretty much like our recent governments, don't mind taking a bit of money for torturing a guy for information. So Nicholas II, he tortured a lot of alchemists. You don't make this much capital investment in all the kit unless you're going to, I guess. And one of the famous people he tortured was an alchemist called Alexander Seton. And he's one of many characters who is said to have managed to manifest the Philosopher's Stone, which we're going to look at in a bit of detail later. The only thing that saved Alexander Seton's life at the hand of Nicholas II was that Nicholas was worried that if he tortured him too much and killed him, that the secret of this transformation would die with him. So in the end, Nicholas kind of let him go a little bit. But not for nothing did Albertus Magus, who was one of the original, Albert Magus, he was a kind of Dark Age alchemist, so around 1200, 1100, he advised his fellow alchemists to avoid having anything to do with princes and noblemen. Very sound piece of advice, which every single one of the guys we're going to look at significantly ignores, alas for them. And whilst the church this is government having a go. The church also really, really did not like the alchemists. And it never actually made it heretical for reasons which I don't quite understand. But one way or the other, it did actually, it did demonise alchemists and alchemy enough to make sure that nobody didn't even whisper the word when you were in the church. And one of the most famous British alchemists was a chap called Roger Bacon. He has got an absolutely astonishing life story. There's a book called Dr. Mirabilis by a chap called James Blish, and it's a novel. Effectively it's fictional, but the chief character in it, all the events in his life are based on the life of Roger Bacon. He was a Franciscan, and he was a champion of the scientific method. What that means is, up until the point when this guy came along, certainly in the West, it's not true elsewhere, but in the West, we had established the church and church dogma into our kind of governmental systems. And along with the church and Christian dogma came dogma associated with a character called Aristotle. Now, he was a brilliant man, and up until this point, people had looked out on the world and they'd had to deduce connections between what they saw outside or above and what they saw below, and they had to go, well, isn't that, you know, we can see 7 planets and there's 7 holes in the human body. There must be some sort of connection here. And by that sort of thought process, they established a really complex cosmology. And that Aristotelian cosmology became established with the church cosmology, and it became just as impossible to question. So for many hundreds of years, this logical Aristotelian idea of the way the world was embedded with the church, and to argue with Aristotle was heresy. Now, what started happening with people like Dr. Mirabilis here is that he started writing the stuff down and going, well, we can measure that. We can have a go at setting up an experiment and seeing if this idea we've got is true. So he started to, and of course what this does is it starts showing that some of the Aristotelian ideas are not quite correct. So that's why he's said to be one of the first scientists. He actually nearly blew himself into the River Thames at one point because he discovered gunpowder. And of course if you discover it and you don't know what it is and you try to heat it up a little bit, very rapidly all the oxygen disappears as a cloud of smoke and you're in the Thames. Now, as a polymath and thinker and the first scientist, obviously he's operating way beyond the expectations or the understandings of any of the people around him, especially the Franciscans with whom he is sharing some kind of monastery. So as a result, he's also branded as a sorcerer and a wizard, and like most of the people we look at today, he spent quite a considerable amount of time in prison. His name has been associated with the original invention of the microscope, the pontoon bridge and the tank. That's 1300 AD, guys, the tank and the pontoon bridge. He's also said to have gained much learning from the devil and to possess a mirror that could enable him to get information from distant places. He's not dissimilar from Dr. Dee. He had an obsidian mirror that was said to be able to read the future in. His fellow confessed, despite the fact that his name has come down to us, Dr. Mirabilis means wonderful teacher, which is a very, very brilliant description of what this guy was. With the deviant, that on his death, his books were nailed to the shelves on which they were found and left to rot. That's what you get for crossing the church. Unfortunately, you really had to be a member of the church to do this work to start with, because you needed to be able to write. And
when was this? In 1500s?
This was 1200s,
right.
the 12s and 1300s. Effectively in our dark ages, some of these guys were beavering away on their own. There were obviously a lot of people trying to stop them. One of the things that we do know about alchemists is that they used a lot of symbols in their work. They used the symbols partly to get whatever power can be got from the symbol itself, which we all understand, sympathetic magic, but also they used symbols to avoid what was happening under the hands of Nicholas II. You use symbols to transmit colourful and complicated ideas so that your other fellows could understand them, but the guys who wanted to torture you couldn't. So they used these symbols partly for the use of the symbol itself and partly to disguise what they were writing. One of the symbols is the Ouroboros, the symbol of the dragon eating its own tail, or it can be a serpent. Really, the dragon and the serpent, to all intents and purposes, are the same thing, and they are symbolic of divine power, if you like, of divine creative influence. The dragon's a symbol of the primal unmanifest, and the god Mercury, who's known by the Greeks as Hermes, who's said to have was one of the characters who brought alchemy to Earth. The circle is symbolic of the eternal cycle of nature, so you've got divine spirit and the eternal cycle of nature all in one really beautiful symbol. Most importantly, the Ouroboros recreates itself by eating its own body. So it's a symbol of nature, it's a symbol of matter transformed, and so it's the primary symbol of alchemy itself. We return a little bit to that later because some interesting stuff comes up about the Ouroboros. Another thing that's major to alchemy is, of course, the phoenix, the symbol of rebirth through fire. This particular one is a masculine phoenix. It's got the two masculine elements under its wings of fire and air. And somewhere there's, I think the feminine one is called an aquila, and it has the other elements. So there's this idea of opposites and balance. But this is your main phoenix. The phoenix is said to have lived its life and done all of its work and things in Arabia. But when its time comes to die, it goes back to Egypt, if you remember the home of alchemy, where it goes up in a cloud of flames, and there's a baby that's just kind of comes out of the ashes somewhere. And that brings us to an interesting point about the phoenix. Quite often you see gorgeous phoenixes that are like peacocks, really gorgeous golden and green and blue things. But whilst I was doing the work for this talk, it became apparent that most phoenixes look like this, kind of small, scraggy and surprised, which I guess, given the way they're born, isn't entirely, shocking. So that's the phoenix, rebirth through fire. Remember, a lot of things that the alchemist did was to do with the gentle heating of stuff, to turn it into something else, because it's thought that that's one of the ways that our organic chemistry arose, was just through gentle heating. So fire was important to them, fire as a means of transformation. And of course, we have a lot of metaphors for that, don't we? A rebirth through fire, a baptism of fire. All of these things are kind of like alchemical metaphors that have been carried through to us. Another couple of symbols that we're fairly familiar with. We've had the Ouroboros here, some more serpents. We've got the rod of Asclepius. Asclepius was one of these guys who was a really, really famous healer in the past from Greece. He's one of those guys who was so good at healing people he could bring guys back from the dead, which is another favourite scheme or metaphor of the alchemists. Not only the extension of life, but bringing people back from the dead, the resolution or the return of a soul into another body. All of these things are associated with Asclepius. It's a single snake up a staff, and for reasons, I guess, historical reasons for me, it always reminds me of the staff of Aaron in the Bible. You remember it's described as a staff with a copper serpent, one copper serpent. And although you could do lots of healing work was done with Aaron's rod, what it's most famous for, of course, is spreading the plagues through Egypt, the plagues of blood and toads and all that. Now, eventually the rod of Asclepius over time was kind of replaced by the rod of Caduceus. And those of you who've seen my sacred geometry talk will know that one of the key things I talk about is the misappropriation of sacred symbols. And this is certainly a symbol which has not only been misappropriated, but then it's been reappropriated and misappropriated again in time. The current orthodox history of this symbol is that it first arose in Sumer, the ancient land of Shinar, which I'll talk about a bit more in the history talk. And that when it arose, it was a symbol for buying and selling. But as a result over time of it being associated with alchemy and with the Kabbalah and with other mystical schools, astronomy it was associated with, it slowly but surely became associated with healing. I find it absolutely fascinating that an ancient symbol for commerce and trade became in the 20th century a symbol for healing and was worn by all of our National Health Service people, and it was on the side of all the ambulances. Now, it really got taken on as a medical symbol when it was taken on board by the American Navy at the turn of the 20th century, about in the first decade of the 1900s. And then around... Sorry?
Sorry, I thought it was in the Illuminati.
Well, they've taken it on as well.
Yeah.
Actually, when we get to it, it was taken on then in the 1940s by the Army, the US Army as well, so they took it on as their medical corps, so it became embedded. But the point of it being an Illuminati thing, I think, refers back to dragon courts and other stuff that's come to us from a long, long time ago. And that is the symbol which is these crossing points of our 7 chakras, and the crown chakra is at the top, which is the one that we're reaching to cross. And also it's said to be an ancient memory and a shamanic memory of the shape of DNA. One way or the other, what's really interesting now is that if you look at your ambulances and your paramedics, they're going back to wearing this. Has everybody noticed that we're moving back to the staff of Asclepius? So we're kind of moving away from a symbol for buying and selling and trade back to a symbol of legendary and mythical healing, which I take as a genuinely good sign. I mean, at the same time, we see the National Health Service being forced to take on chiropractic and acupuncture. There's no way it would be doing that unless there was a lot of people absolutely making it do it. And I think that the return of this old symbol is probably ultimately a good sign. Other major symbols, we've got two triangles, one pointing down and one pointing up, water and fire. There's a lot of opposites in here which are quite important. People know they don't want to get me started on triangles. I could do another half hour. I could certainly do a lot of time about the kind of the upward pointing sort of mother of form, reaching up just like all the plants and everything does. As the sun just comes up in the morning, things start to unfurl and reach up to kind of Father Sun. Father Sun himself, of course, is data. It's raw data coming down, giving us information, feeding ourselves. We ourselves give off light. So you've got the Father of Consciousness coming down and the Mother of Form reaching up. And of course, when they actually match each other perfectly, you get Solomon's seal. That is the creation of a new and complex unity from the synthesis of opposites. So those symbols are really complex, really beautiful things. They're simple things to look at, but their entire mythos is hung off them by the alchemists. Mercury and sulphur. It's fairly clear why the alchemists were so interested in mercury, because they were interested in the transmutation of elements, the changing of one thing into another, the unfolding of things as they grew. And they believed that things kind of moved from the dull to the shiny, if you like. Mercury, I think they chose because it's a metal and it runs around on glass. That's the kind of thing that is naturally of interest to alchemists. I'm not quite sure why they chose sulphur. I'm sure something will turn up eventually which will tell me. But they believe that all things come about as a result of the interaction in the belly of the earth of mercury and sulphur. And that one thing sort of leads to another, which sort of leads to another. Now, that might have seemed like a really crazy idea 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, but we now know how elements are born in the heart of stars. We understand that hydrogen has only got one proton in its core and one electron on the outside, that helium's got 2 protons in its nucleus and 2 electrons in its core, in its cage by and large, that beryllium, or was it lithium's got 3. So, and those 3 things are kind of how everything started. There was hydrogen and helium and a tiny, tiny bit of 1 or 2 other things. And apparently those elements have to get sucked into the heart of stars, where they get burnt and burnt away and loads of things happen. Millions of things are created and destroyed, but the overall result is a small bunch of elements that have got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 protons in their nucleus, and they're the ones that we're made of. The nitrogen, the helium, the carbon, the oxygen, all of those things come from first generation stars. And then those themselves get blown into space, and they hang around for a while, until something knocks them all together into a 3rd generation star, and then you start seeing the heavier elements coming out. So in a way, they were right. It all starts with not with hydrogen, not with mercury and sulphur, but with hydrogen and helium. But does everybody understand that they had the right kind of idea, that stuff sort of stacks up? We'll talk about it later. The sun and the moon, they celebrated all sorts of opposites. We see the marriage of the sun and the moon a lot in alchemical literature. And really what it's a representation of is often light and darkness, the masculine and the feminine, the outer and the inner. There's always an emphasis on opposites, especially on male and female and the volatile and the fixed. They had this idea of kind of proportion and dimension. But they also understood that over time transformation would lead to this volatile, changeable thing becoming fixed. And the thing that appears really fixed eventually over time would become volatile. So they understood that there would be a complete transformation of things. Has anybody heard the old riddle about what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? The answer being that the unstoppable force stops and the immovable object moves. So what happens is you've had this state of being for all this time. When these rules appear to be true, that thing's never going to move, and there's nothing in the world that can make it move. And then just suddenly your entire paradigm changes. All the rules that applied before that occurred don't apply anymore. And that's the kind of thing that the alchemists were reaching for, a sort of paradigm shift. Paracelsus eventually decided to add a third element to the mercury and the sulphur, and this is where he started getting himself into trouble with the church. He connected mercury with spirit and sulphur with the soul, which is probably some clue as to a lot of the complexity that the alchemists attached to these two elements, as it were. He added the body at the peak of the pyramid and salt. And what got him into trouble was the fact that he said that the body is the pinnacle of the manifestation of your spiritual entity. That this is where your spirit has got you so far. This is the best thing there is. And that spirit and soul was somehow secondary to that. Now obviously the church was going, your body is shit. Your body is sinful, your body is a crime, and what you're reaching for is your spirit and your soul and where you're going to after here. Paracelsus was saying we're much more important than that. This is what it's all about. He was obviously quite a cocky character because Celsus was a bit of an Asclepius character. Celsus was known, at least to orthodoxy, as the greatest medic of all time. You know, he's the one that had actually brought it all off. Paracelsus means greater than Celsus, so we can see that he had no small opinion of himself. His real name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hockenheim. But he was an aristocrat, he was, which is where he got all his money from. His middle name, Bombastus, was said to be the root of the word bombastic, which, given that he called himself Paracelsus, you know, greater than Celsus, seems like a reasonable argument. I don't think it's quite true. It's something to do with stuffing silk moths, I think, actually. Anyway, whatever, he's said to be the father of sort of holistic medicine, in as far as he was the first one to believe, if you like, in treating the whole person. He was a great believer in the power of the mind, and he also believed that there was undeniable truth in the mutual nature of the worlds above and below. He was his idea that you could also change the inner state of an entity by putting stuff from outside into it, i.e. medicine, I think gives him a fair claim to being the father of allopathic medicine as well. Whatever, not only was he unpopular with the church, he was also really unpopular with his fellow nobles, because he used to treat the poor for free, but he used to really screw the notes out of anybody he treated in the aristocracy. Paracelsus. Oh yes. There we see one of the symbols, one of the pictures that got the alchemists such a bad rep. They seem to be quite good at keeping themselves unpopular. It's got kind of, you've got a really wild looking bloke with a massive beard. He's got wings, the wings of Mercury on his ankles. His body's got kind of dragon-like and serpent-like qualities, so both sorts of auras, if you like. He's got signs for the sun and the moon and Mercury over his head. I've got no idea what it means, but I just couldn't resist including it, really. So, having seen that, you know, why should we care? You know, we've seen a bunch of interesting people doing some interesting things, and we can quite identify with a lot of it, especially the Paracelsus stuff. But it actually turns out that many of the fathers of modern science were actively interested in the transmutation of elements, the balancing of the inside through the external elements, the tuning of the small to the large. This includes people like Robert Boyle and especially Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton wrote more books on alchemy than he did on the physical sciences. But he's not so famous for that because his relatives sequestered all of that stuff on his death, because they wanted us to remember him as the master of the Royal Mint and the founder of the Royal Society and all of that. But his material eventually found its way out into the public, but it really was a long time. And he was working, Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, was working on gem magic, on perpetual motion machines, on crystals, on light. He did loads and loads of really amazing work. So that's one reason why we should be interested in it, is because the people on whom our entire science, even with the arrival of quantum mechanics, that just subsumed Isaac Newton's stuff. But the people who wrote the laws that are at the bottom of our modern physics were alchemists. Alchemy really did become science. Another interesting point is that in late 1400s, Sir George Ripley's alchemical laboratories were turning over £100,000 a year to the Knights of St John. Some of us will have heard of the Knights of St John. Just like the better-known Knights Templar, they were pretty frequently accused of being sorcerers and heretics. One of the reasons they got accused of that was because they had shed loads of cash. Ripley's Labs, £100,000 a year, okay? Now, we've had some workshops with a chap called No, I can't remember his name. It's gone for the moment. Tim Carroll, that's it. He was Master of Words at the Shakespearean Globe down in London for the first 5 years. And he said that £100,000 in Shakespeare's time would be worth 100 million in today's money. So that means George Ripley's alchemical labs were turning over £100 million to the Knights of St John. Now that is a thoroughly interesting relationship.
And what they did with it.
Sorry?
And what they did with all that money.
I wonder what they did with it. I used it to suppress the heat, or ran away with it and buried it up in Scotland somewhere, perhaps. I don't know what they were certainly. It was expensive to run the Crusades for them, but both the Knights of St John and the Knights Templar ended up with far more money than you would reasonably expect. But this isn't too suspicious because Ripley was a major bloke. He was running a laboratory that was turning out medicines and chemicals and all manner of things. He was a chemist. We call him an alchemist, but he was turning out stuff which was extremely valuable. Many of the people that I looked at in this talk survived for twice as long as their contemporaries. Some of them even lasted to be 90 or 100 years old at a time when people were only living to be 45 or 50. Quite a lot of the alchemists' discoveries kind of preceded modern science. So Bacon, the guy we looked at earlier, he discovered a thing called antimony, and this is an element that turns out both as a metal and as a non-metal. Now you can see why that fascinated them. They're really interested by that. Camera obscura was another thing that was invented about north. Somebody came up with mirrors enough to build a tower that you could get into this tower and see everything that was going on outside by using mirrors and light reflected onto a table inside the tower. And apparently this went down really well when it was first invented, before kind of 1000 AD. And then some poor Italian came up with the same idea in the 1700s and got banged up and they never let him go. So these ideas get kind of discovered and then lost, and things that were popular kind of 1,000 years ago can turn out to be a heresy in later years. Alcohol distillation of porcelain, both ends of the pub chain, the in and the out, they both came out of the alchemist lab, very popular with yours faithfully. The bain-marie, the thing they use in pubs for destroying your food on a Sunday, in the carvery, they have a kind of warm pool of water and your food goes in a stainless steel dish and it's gently heated from underneath. That was originally a product of the alchemist lab, and it was invented by a lady called Maria Prophetissa, who I've seen described as semi-legendary and as mythical. I don't know what that means. Some people think she was born 100 BC, people think she was born 100 AD. But whoever she was a real shit-hot geometer. She knew a lot about sacred geometry, and she's also apparently responsible for inventing half of the things that were used in the alchemist lab for their various transformations. Sodium nitrate is used in rocket fuel bombs and weed killers, and that's been discovered by several alchemists, more or less back in the Dark Ages. And phosphorus, two sorts. There's the white sort, which glows in the dark and bursts into flames on contact with air, and is used by Israelis to look for Palestinians. And the other one is pink, which is what we use for kind of lighted matches with. So all of those things came out of your alchemist lab. What was it? It was the art of transformation. It was part of the Hermetic arts, which are alchemy, magic and astrology. And the Hermetic arts are named after a famous character called Hermes Trismegistus, who wrote kind of 8 rules. He wrote a thing called the Emerald Tablet and the 8 rules of alchemy. And he's believed to have been a priest in Old Kingdom Egypt, which takes alchemy back to about 2600 BC. That appears to have been where the writings were originally born, and they've kind of applied them to Hermes. Here's a picture of him. This is really, really beautiful mosaic, and it's on the floor of the entrance hall to a medieval cathedral in Siena. So it's the father of alchemy and the Hermetic arts. So in Siena, Italy? Yeah. And this is a real beautiful rendition of him, look, kind of holding the tablets of information and helping out people that are coming to him looking for help. And I think it's really interesting that it's on the floor of a cathedral as well. I think probably there were things going on when they were building the medieval cathedrals. There was a lot more alchemy and geometry still remembered then. And I think it's very open of these people to have put a picture of Hermes actually on their church floor. only have been pretty acceptable in this form to your churchgoers, I guess. But here's your alchemist's rendition of Hermes. This wouldn't have gone down quite so well on the floor of the cathedral, I don't think. We've got the wings of the dying or the dead phoenix down here. We've got your character of Hermes, and he's got the symbol for the sun and the moon. He's got a pair of caduceus staffs. He's got the symbol for Mercury over his head. He's got wings on his back. You could have them on your Mercury figure, has wings anywhere. And then we've got these two interesting characters either side of him. There's one who's standing really right. He's all buttoned up and he's got his trousers all gaitered. He's got a single snake up his sword, and he's obviously prepared to fence. You can see that he's a character who sort of knows what he's doing. This one looks a lot less well prepared. He's got buboes on his arm, he's got a big furry beard, he's not so well attired. He's got your standard scared and scraggy looking phoenix on the end of his sword. And this is a symbol for the balancing of the wild and the civilized. The wild man is a really important image in alchemy. You've got, if you like, the family man who lives in the compound, gets married, has children, all of that. And then you have the wild man who lives in the woods and frightens the kids. The most important thing is that you need both of those men. And of course, one of the things that modern society is doing is it's insisting, and it applies to the women as well, you need both sorts. You need the one with kind of, the mad look in her eye who lives in a gingerbread house in the woods, and the one who actually makes the ale at home. But what this is saying is you need the balance of both of those things. Important to alchemy, as important to nearly all schools of thought, are the basic elements: earth, air, fire, water and ether. First written down in the 5th century by a guy called Empedocles. And he decided that not only were there these 4 elements, but that they were governed by strife and love. Which I think when we look out at the world today, we can see that he had a fair point. But really the point is that the whole building up and the mixing of life and the transformation of it is to do with the driving apart of things and then the mixing of them together, which is the basic point he was making. Some people say quite fairly, look, they got confused, didn't they? Because we've got hundreds of elements now, and we know that these aren't the elements. But they were still describing the elemental states, which is basically solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. So they still kind of understood something about it. These are still elemental conditions. They also, of course, had the 5th element, ether, quintessence, which was the element, if you like, upon which all of these other elements were projected. Aristotle moved the idea of the elements forward in his time here, and he very cleverly added hot and dry and wet and cold. Now we're aware, aren't we, that these are still very important in Chinese medicine and in certain other medicines that are to do with the diet. And what's so clever about this is that it shows us some of the ways that these alchemical diagrams can hold a lot more information and be a lot more complex than they originally seemed to be. So the earth is seen as being cold and dry, fire as being hot and dry, air as being hot and wet, and water as wet and cold. And the idea is that by making water cold, it goes solid and you turn it into earth, and by making water more wet, it becomes air. So he started to work on the kind of process of transformation between these various elemental states, and that's part of the Aristotle canon that got kind of embedded, but it was important work. One of the elements that was particularly important is water. This is a picture I came across 2 or 3 times in the research for this talk, and it shows a couple of characters wringing the morning dew from a towel in order to perform the great work. There's the moon and the sun up there, and there's no mention in any of the descriptions of this picture. They don't even talk about this, whatever it is. I don't know whether it's a building or a radiance or what it is. But the main reason this picture's in here is because it's a 17th century engraving, and this is the point at which your alchemists could start to say, some alchemists could start to say heretical things and get away with them. We were starting to see a movement from the kind of theological to the importance of the measured and the really real. And what happened around this time is this is an old style picture where people painted things as they looked on the landscape. It was only as we made the move towards modern science that all of our pictures started drawing their way like that one is, to have a perspective so that everything's drawn to the human point of view. Up until that point, things were painted differently. And interestingly, the same transformation happened as we moved from, if you like, Newtonian physics into quantum physics, we started seeing a change in painting to things like Impressionism and Pointillism. So it's almost like these changes in the way we're looking at the world are changes in consciousness, are changes in... So because the alchemists and the artists are seen as dealers in dirt and human nature, dealing in the same thing, it's not surprising to find that our artistic expression of the community changes as the expression of the community changes as it's trying to look into the world in which it lives. Absolutely everything was important to the alchemists when they were doing their work. The idea of a unified worldview plays a central part in alchemy. They were trying to kind of keep it together rather than see it falling apart. But attention was paid to the position of the stars, the phases of the moon, dreams were recorded, intuition was listened to. There was nothing that was unrelated or irrelevant to the experiment in hand. And of course, that view is still pretty commonplace on most of the planet, and even our physicists have come to realise that everything they do, the setting up of the experiment, who the experimenter is, what the apparatus is that's looking at the result, all of those are completely critical to it, and none of it can be kind of disentangled. So have a quick look at the process, just a quick look at the process before the break, and then after the break I'm going to look at one or two of the cleverer alchemists that there were around, especially towards Shakespearean times, and we're also going to see how people got around to building or representing alchemical myths, sometimes in the most spectacular stone structures. The process is basically one of transformation of a base material into something, is the way that most of them did. The first part of the three-phase process is called nigredo, which comes from the word black, and it involves the taking and processing of a lesser matter or a base material, and the study of this seems to be a subject in itself. Base material is described as everywhere present, worthless, vile, and despised by all men. Those are the terms in which it's described throughout the literature, and everybody had a different idea of what this is. For Newton it was antimony, that thing discovered by Bacon that could be both a metal and a non-metal, although it was the same element. Others thought it was mercury for its running around techniques. Some thought it was the human imagination. For the mother of alchemy, Maria Prophetissa, it was the confused mass of the alchemist's self that was the base material. Now that's a pretty Jungian idea for somebody who's around Naught AD, I think. She had a lot of them actually. She's one of the people I'd really like to look a bit more into, because I think quite a lot of her stuff survives, or quite a lot of stuff that was at least assigned to her. The second stage, once you've got the base material, obviously some people, there's a lot of people who aren't really doing the alchemy and they really misunderstood it. So excrescents generally, you can imagine, piss and shit and pus, anything, the base of the material, for some people, the more chance there was of somehow getting gold out of it. So the second stage was to take this base material, whatever it was, and to cleanse it, to refine it. And it was called albedo, which is to whiten, which is associated with the word white. And the third stage was rubedo, which is to redden, which is the manifestation of the philosopher's stone, or the elixir. And this is called, we see this throughout drama and poetry and opera, as the mystic union of the soul and body, conjunctio, the chemical wedding, the marriage of the king and queen, the marriage of the sun and moon. All of these are, if you like, symbols of the manifestation of the philosopher's stone. And it was thought to be a direct revelation that humanity partakes in divine wonders and actually has divine secrets sleeping within it. And it was thought that all works of transformation, theatrical space, in the laboratory, the inner space of the human, everywhere where transformation was happening was regarded as alchemical space. Has everybody here been to a theatre, a live theatre, and seen a play on a stage? Sometimes when you get a bigger audience, there's 10 or 20 people who've never seen a live theatre show. Those of you who have will be aware of the transformation that occurs. When you see something really excellent on the stage, you're drawn into it in no time at all, and it won't let you go until you get to the end of it. It's even more so if you're actually on the stage playing a part, because you go from nothing, where with Shakespeare, for example, the people doing it quite often don't understand it in the first read through, and then it just gets more and more real as you practice it, and then you get to put the fancy togs on, and it gets to feel even more real. And then when there's an audience out there, in a way it's really happening on the stage for you, in a real way, because if the person who's supposed to deliver your line isn't there, it's not going to happen. And that does occur, you know. And so on the stage it's a real thing. I saw a stage company recently doing a version of the Seagull which they were inventing as they went along. Several people could play each of the parts, and they played scissors, paper, stone for who was going to play the parts in front of the audience. So every time they did it, they had different playing different parts, and they were making it up as they went along. And I'm not joking. As soon as they started, you couldn't leave it alone. And by the end of the play, you were genuinely worried about the mental state of the people on the stage. Absolutely incredible. The transformation they were ringing on the audience because you'd never seen it before and they'd never seen it before, simply because it had never happened before. Now that's the kind of transformation we're talking about. And you need to remember as well that the difference between somebody who walks on fire and burns and the person who walks on fire and only burns the trouser turn-ups off is a state of mind. So this is really important stuff. The other thing about the Negredo-Rubedo system is that it's thought, and it's believed, that there are actually several levels of gold. That you can have white gold and red gold. People might have read a little bit about white gold in connection with Saqqara in Egypt and levitation devices and things. So it's thought that there's a whole level associated with alchemy that was certainly being practiced in Egypt and probably in other places. Symbolically, we see references to this kind of process throughout the works of Shakespeare. A lot of the tales, a lot of the basic tales and the plots and things are actually alchemical metaphors. So we quite often see the old king, don't we? He's often dying, he's quite often insane, and here's basically the old matter or the old consciousness that has to be shattered during the Grado, during this first part of the process. And then we see the young prince, the king's son, the new consciousness, and he's supposed to end the play kind of shining and preferably married after his refinement through whatever the process of the play is. But of course we know, don't we, that sooner or later the young prince, he's going to become the old consciousness and he'll be driven and mad and his son will have to come along. And this is the internal cycle of nature, the dying away and the rising up, the really important thing. If you look in shamanic societies, the Native American Indians and the Maya, especially all the peoples who lived in the Maya lands in fact, they have colours associated with the directions, north, south, east and west, and they also have primary energies that are associated with those days. So the east and red is often associated with initiation or base material. The second part of the cycle will be white, will be associated with the north and with refinement. The next part with the west and with the transformation of the refined object. And lastly, you'll go to the south, which is the seed of that process. Now it strikes me that this is also a memory of how important this transformative process is and how important human beings are in their ability to express this on earth. But by Elizabethan times, many alchemists were beginning to see their own reflections as kind of, their own actions as reflections in miniature of the biblical Genesis. They actually saw themselves as pulling matter out of the ground of being, if you like. And now we have to bear in mind that scientists are making new elements. There's now a whole string, I think there's 2 rows of elements at the bottom of the elemental table that were made by human beings. This means that because we're here, it's no longer necessary for things to get boiled up in stars. Because we're here, new elements are coming into being, new things that weren't in the universe before. And when our star finally swells up and explodes, it will blow all of this stuff out there, so the next generation of stars will have new elements to play with. That's where alchemy eventually took us. So after the break, we'll have a look at some of the people. As long as you're happy to come back and have some more, we'll look at some specific cases.
Are we going to do questions right at the end, not now?
If that's okay, or you can come and have a quick chat during, I don't mind, whilst I slurp on my cider. Yes, but we'll let everybody go for the moment. For all coming back. Right.
Definitely.
Thank you very much. So, We're going to look at one or two of the people that did some of this spectacular work and hear a little bit about them. And one or two, we're going to Planet Nick a little bit at the end, where we see some of the things that just kind of occurred to me as I was starting. And we kick off with a character called Giordano Bruno. He made himself successfully pretty unpopular with the church, as he had all sorts of ideas. He was effectively an early Darwinist in the sense that he was one of the formulators of a theory called the Great Chain Theory, where they kind of realised that everything was connected to everything else. This idea, you know, man is supposed to be separate from the animals and everything, and this really didn't go down well with the church. He also deduced that the stars must be other suns, probably with planets revolving around them, with other critters living on the other planets, and that also didn't go down very well with the church. But one of his main problems was that he became interested in the nature of ideas and the nature of words. There came a point when the Bible was translated from Latin into English, for example, and at that point all sorts of things which had been completely incomprehensible to people, and they'd heard them every weekend, they could suddenly understand them, and they could see that they could be swearing oaths, and Jesus says in the Bible you're not allowed to swear oaths. Things like this caused a huge ruckus across society. And the meaning of words and what they're actually saying, we do this now. People will tell you that, you know, one of the stems of the word religion is to bind. And it became important, this thing, to people. And this guy was one of the first guys to start looking at words and their actual meaning and what you're really being told by the things that are being put in front of you. He, like a lot of them, he had a reputation as a magician, especially because, like a lot of these guys, he had the ability to execute absolutely massive feats of memory. It seems to be the really good way of hypnotising a king, is to be able to remember lots of stuff, and he was very good at it. So he attracted the attention of Henry III of France. You'll remember that all of these guys were told to avoid kings and noblemen. You'll be able to see that they took absolutely not a fart's worth of notice of that particular piece of advice. This guy, although he got on with Henry III, it was only for a while, and eventually he was kind of somehow forced into Elizabeth's court. And Elizabeth really didn't like him. She thought he was subversive and dangerous, and he thought that her court and the English as a whole were crude. And in fairness, that's what it would have been like in these days. London at this time existed on immigration. People were dying in London faster than they were being born. It was a really awful place to be. If you wanted to be in a court or something in these days, you'd have wanted to be in the Alhambra or somewhere in Spain. In Arabia, it's really beautiful. They've really got the hang of it. But there's every chance in London of getting something filthy thrown over you. Bruno stated that Christianity is not rational, that it's philosophically unsound, that it disagrees with other religions. He also stated that revelation through faith has no scientific basis, and further that parts of the widely accepted Aristotelian work were undermined by the new discoveries of science. Given all of this, I'm sure you will not be surprised to find that he was eventually found guilty of heresy, and he was put to death by the Inquisition. Until that point, he'd been highly geographically mobile, and he'd gone through several courts in Europe, making a fair amount of money and a fair amount of impact. But absolutely every single one of his patrons he eventually outraged. Most interesting, I think, were his actual writings, which seemed almost prophetic. I asked people at this point to just close their eyes for a couple of minutes and listen to what this man, born in 1548, had to say about the state of the earth. He said, "This entire globe, this star, not being subject to death, and dissolution and annihilation being impossible anywhere in nature, from time to time renews itself by changing and altering its parts. There is no absolute up or down, no absolute position in space, but the position of a body is relative to that of other bodies. Everywhere there is incessant relative change in position throughout the universe, and the observer is always at the centre of things." Now that would seriously not be out of place in the third millennium physics paper, and he was writing 500 or 600 years ago. He knew what we know. He knew what we know, but they didn't have the maths. Somehow they didn't have the maths. So that was Giordano Bruno, an amazing character, and a bit like Dr. Mirabilis or Roger Bacon. He's well worth, and Maria Prophetess.
Say this again,
Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno. He was a Dominican priest, so he was another guy that was in religious orders, and this is one of the reasons why you get into so much trouble, because they regard themselves as having put a lot of time and money into your education, and they don't like it when you start complaining about their ideas. Claudio Monteverdi, probably a really famous name to us. Most of us don't recognise him as an alchemist. His alchemical work was done on the stage. He basically invented opera. What he wanted to do was he wanted to do it big. Some of these people realise that absolutely everything in life, as I was explaining earlier, can be condensed and projected onto a stage. They did really big special effects in Elizabethan theatre. It's one of the magical things they learnt how to do. And they did it even bigger in opera. And all of Claudio Monteverdi's operas have got hermetic or alchemical themes. You look at the plots, you'll see alchemical metaphor just shouting out to you. Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor. This is actually a picture of Rudolph II as he was when he was Elector of Saxony, a bit like Nicholas II. The reason why I chose this instead of a picture of him as the Holy Roman Emperor is I really got the codpiece. So, amazing pair of trousers, eh? You really do have to be a king and an emperor to get away with dressing like that, otherwise they get beaten to a pulp. He was a very interesting chap. He was interested in astrology, the occult, alchemy and the Kabbalah. So he was one of the mystical ones rather than the chemical ones. He had a lifelong quest as a result to find this Philosopher's Stone. Which, if you remember, the Philosopher's Stone is basically, it gives you the ability to turn lead into gold, but that is the proof that it's the Philosopher's Stone. It's not its use. Its use is to extend your life and to perhaps make you immortal. So he worked hard at trying to find that. But mostly he spent generously to get other famous alchemists into his court to do that work on his behalf. So he financed Johannes Kepler, one of my favourite geometricians, who did a lot of work on the relationship between the shape of the geometric solids and the orbits of the spheres. So he was pretty dodgy as far as the church were concerned. Rudolph II helped look after him. Rudolph II helped shelter John Dee, who we've heard of from Elizabethan court, from church persecution. And this guy, Holy Roman Emperor, he spent most of his life in opposition to the papacy, which also tended to, even as a king or an emperor, would get you into trouble in those days. Now, basically he endured quite a lot of bouts of mental illness in his time, and he was particularly tried. The things that tended to lead to his breakdown were the divisive struggles between the various churches in his land. He really distrusted the Roman Catholic Church because, as he correctly pointed out, and even now, 600 years later, this is true, it had successfully maintained a monolithic power base without interruption for 1600 years and was still doing it. And he thought that was just wrong. It just really made his little hair stand on end. But he didn't really like the Protestants either, because they did the opposite thing. Instead of maintaining a suitable single face and trying to do the job, they were constantly falling out with each other, so that every 6 months you've got a new Protestant clique and they're all fighting amongst each other. And it just drove the guy bonkers. It just made him want to spend his time in his alchemical laboratories and not doing the work looking after his country. And as a result of that, the poor bloke got blamed for actually starting the 30 Years' War, which was one of the most deadly and horrible wars that Europe ever faced, which is just typical, because he actually died 7 years before that war started. But it's always useful to pin it on the last guy who's now dead. It was nothing to do with us, governor. Tommaso de Campanella, he was another one, like Giordano Bruno. He was another Dominican prodigy. He was also brought into conflict with the ecclesiastical authorities because he took on a lot of Bruno's ideas. Because as you can see, he was sort of 20 years later and he developed them, which made him, he was even less popular really in his way. He fled Naples from Rome, then Florence, then Venice, then Padua, then Bologna, and he was constantly on the move from the Inquisition, constantly finding himself again new places to work, new people who were willing to give him money. But eventually he got homesick and he really wanted to go back to Calabria. He wanted to hear the language that the people at home spoke. And as soon as he got there, the people at home denounced him to the Inquisition for alleged political conspiracy. And he consequently, and this is true of lots of them in detail, he spent 27 years in prison, during which he was tried 5 times, repeatedly tortured, and eventually he was done for being author of a book that was published 30 years before he was born. So you can see the world management team were just as convincing and effective in those days as they are now. Now, it's said that there's 100,000 books being written about alchemy, more possibly than any other single subject. And those 100,000 books are kind of split. There's a load of people who say it's a history of the greatest secret ever known, and the others who say it's the history of a lie. So as usual, we see for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. Well, during his time in prison, this guy wrote 40 volumes on politics, philosophy, monarchy, atheism, metaphysics and theology. So it was by locking them all up and giving them a permanent supply of pens and paper. He was a lucky one. He's one of the few lucky ones. Actually, in 1626, Pope Urban VIII moved Thomas de Campanella to the prison of the Inquisition in Rome. Doesn't look good, does it? Once you get in there, you really are in trouble. They're going to start hammering wedges into your shins. But 3 years later, it turned out that somebody was threatening Urban VIII with some kind of magical thing. And what did he get on his knees and pray to Yahweh and go, rescue me, O God? No. He goes down to the prison of the Inquisition and he says, Thomas, I've got a problem. Thomas says, no problem, I'll sort it out. Anyway, one way or the other, Urban VIII is all right. The spell doesn't happen, and he thanks Thomas, and he lets him go. So Thomas basically flees to Paris straight away. As soon as he's let out, he runs off to Paris, where Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu are in charge, the guys from the Three Musketeers, and he puts themselves under their protection. As a result, he's a rare alchemist. He dies peacefully and quietly in his bed in the Abbaye de Saint-Honoré in Paris. Nice bloke. And all because he protected a Catholic Pope from a magical spell. Great, isn't it? When push comes to shove, I don't think they've necessarily got as much faith as they think they might have. Now, it's really weird, isn't it? He spent 27 years in prison and all that, and just like, Giordano Bruno, he had a really hard time. But he thought, his idea was that alchemy, and all of that was to prove that all worldly powers should serve the church, and that all secular science should be subservient to religion. They banged him up anyway. What's going to show that nobody likes a smart arse or something. Now we come to another of my favourite characters in history, this guy, Cornelius Drebbel, most famous for the invention of a six-oared submarine, which he demonstrated to a crowd of several thousand people in James I, sometime in the early 1600s, by keeping it underwater in the River Thames for 3.5 hours. An amazing trick. Interestingly, this is one of the places where the internet gets quite fascinating, because you go to the BBC website to say, well, how are they running a submarine without oxygen, is what I was thinking. And on the BBC website, it says that they had like a kind of like a concertina thing that came out and went to the top of the water. But it's not really a submarine, is it? That's what the BBC website says, that's how he got oxygen into his submarine. Most of the other websites concerned with Drebbel say nobody knows how Drebbel got oxygen into his submarine, which is an interesting point. We know that the Babylonians actually had the ability to deal with oxygen and things. We also know that Cornelius Drebbel was the friend of a really brilliant Swiss alchemist, who's another one who's thought to have manifested the Philosopher's Stone. But one of the things he definitely did is he discovered oxygen and what it was 150 years before we started fighting about it in Europe. So Drebbel was the mate of a person who knew what oxygen was. Whether he knew how to produce it to put it into a submarine is another thing. Drebbel also came up eventually with a much faster 12-oared submarine. One of the things he was really famous for was Drebbel actually built a perpetual motion machine, which said time, date and season. I've seen pictures of it, these amazing great big spheres on columns and things. And it was the production of that got him a job as court alchemist with Frederick II. Remember the guy with the amazing codpiece? He got his job as court alchemist with him by showing him this perpetual motion machine, but it was a bit of sleight of hand. Actually, the way these spheres worked was they had clockwork mechanisms in them, and the clockwork rewound itself as a result of slight changes in air pressure. So what you've actually got is a machine that's clockwork, but it looks like it never needs to be rewound. Clever, isn't it? You don't need to see what's going on. You really don't. So he got the title of chief alchemist in the court of Rudolf II. His real preference, though, was for the study of chemical processes and ideas rather than for the Philosopher's Stone. And his most famous written work was on the transmutation of elements. So that's, again, he was effectively a chemist. He was known, apart from his 6-oared and 12-oared submarines, He's also credited with the invention of the thermostat as early as 1619 and a compound microscope with 2 sets of convex lenses. Again, a pretty trick thing to be pulling off at his time. But because he was making microscopes, he also made a machine for grinding lenses, I assume because it was hard to get them otherwise. He made telescopes, he made a storm machine for the theatrical stage, and as I say, lots of these guys were as interested in producing illusion on a stage as they were in doing the laboratory work. But another thing about this character, and this is a thing that recurs a lot through history, is he actually created a projector. He created a moving image projector. We've got accounts of this machine, and we know it existed, but we've got no plans for it. So before they had electric light, this was a proper projection machine, not one of those ones which when you turn the handle it looks like the horse is going up and down. And this happens again and again. We've got writings throughout history of these amazing machines being built by people a long time before you think they would. And we haven't got any evidence of all these machines. One of them turned up. Anybody heard of the Antikythera mechanism? Which was found effectively in a Roman boat that went down between 20 BC and 80 BC, and embedded in this kind of stone and sediment was a really complicated geared machine. They've now reconstructed it, they've managed to separate a lot of it, and it's got 20 gears in it, and as it's driven round it tells time, date and season. It tells the patterns of Venus, Mercury and Mars, and it tells you in which of the 4 places that the Olympic Games can be held is going to be held this year. Totally amazing piece of tackle. Even more weird is that they're special bronze alloy cast wheels, all of the cogs in it, and they're made out of an older machine. Really brilliant. There's no reference to that machine in any writings, but there's reference to a lot of other machines like it in writings where we haven't got the machines. So you can perhaps start to see how some of the things that we've got nowadays we have had before and we've lost them. They've sort of disappeared. Drebbel, for all of his building and development, and he's a really interesting guy. For all of the stuff he built, mostly on the ideas of others, Drebbel ended his life as an impoverished alehouse keeper. He used to have an alehouse. And we're now really moving into the area. These guys were all they were moving to the side, they were getting themselves into trouble. This next lot, that really didn't occur to. It didn't occur to Jacob Bohem because he basically moved away from doing any work at all, and he said, perfectibility of the human spirit, no problem. Jesus died on the cross for our sins, that is all we need to perfect our own inner self. So he took it out of the laboratory altogether and just put Jesus as the philosopher's stone. Robert Flood was the son of Queen Elizabeth's war treasurer. As such, he didn't tend to get himself into a lot of trouble. He was interested in architecture and the theatre. In fact, he was probably partly responsible for the design of the Globe Theatre, which is a 20-sided geometric figure with something like 4 stories in it. And his amazing feats of memory were done by planting himself in this 20-sided thing and remembering where he put everything. Amazing character, really. He did a lot of stage work. He totally believed that the whole mystery of creation could be played out on the stage for the transformation of an audience. He successfully studied medicine, very successfully studied medicine. He was another great guy, but his Paracelsian leanings delayed for some time his entry into the Royal College of Physicians. That means he was a homeopath, and the Royal College of Physicians didn't want to let him in. They distrusted his esoteric mystical speculations, and they found him arrogant and defensive.
What year was this?
This was in the early 1600s, and it hasn't changed at all. I mean, they found him arrogant and offensive. I should think he probably thought pretty much the same thing as them. He was another one, do you remember Ripley, who was turning all that money over to the Knights of St John? This guy, once he got the hang of it, he built his own laboratory and he prepared chemical remedies, he prepared medicines, he performed alchemical experiments, he was using horoscopes and all sorts of other established methods of diagnosis. He was another of these guys who really concentrated everything on what he was doing, and he didn't think any of it was irrelevant, and perhaps as a result of that he ended up being quite a rich man. He said many things, lots of stuff in the notes which you'll get to see about this guy that we don't have time to do, but one of the things he said was all souls, whether of men or brutes, are none other than particles of the same soul. Now up until this point that would most certainly have got him burnt at the stake. even at this point, had he not been Queen Elizabeth I's war treasurer's son, he might still have been burnt at the stake. But what we are starting to see now is the division of theology from science. And that's the point at which alchemy, if you like, becomes a bit of a mystery, bit of a misty concept. We're starting to see the real importance of the measurement of the world and the primacy of the really real over the spiritual, which is the situation we're in now.
But that was very political at that time, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. Things were really, really changing. They were. And it's a change in consciousness. It's reflected in art and everything. It's far more important than the words I put in over here. It can only give you some idea of this massive change. It's not like we're looking just at an arising of a science. We're looking at an arising of new political systems and new artistic systems. The whole thing is going up a level as this happens. And at the same time, people are no longer getting banged up for heresy, necessarily. Some people are, of course, but that's because they've been making more trouble than flood and they haven't got as much money. Then we get to John Dee. He's one of the most famous. He was an alchemist as well, but he originally became famous because he did an amazing stage stunt. He built this stage scarab, which somebody flew across the stage on, and everybody goes, "John, that's magic." And he goes, "Well, stagecraft, engineering," and they go, "Well, still, it's pretty magic, isn't it?" The way he really got into his life was he wrote a horoscope for Mary and another horoscope for Elizabeth, Mary's sister. Mary really didn't like the horoscope that John Dee wrote for her, so she banged him up when she was queen. But as we know, Mary was eventually, I think she was eventually kind of betrayed. Elizabeth's advisors managed to convince Elizabeth that Mary was in a plot to kill her, and as a result Mary was removed from the throne. I think they did. I think they put her to death in the Tower, and Elizabeth came on the throne. Elizabeth was much more impressed by John Dee's astrological predictions than Mary had been, and so she let him out and gave him a job when she came to the throne, and effectively he became the head of like what we'd call a call centre of psychics. He had hundreds of psychics reporting to him. He was a good astrologer himself, but I don't think he was much of a medium. And one of the guys that was working for him in this kind of psychic hotline trade was called Kelly, and he really was good. So the thing was, they were somehow, one way or the other, getting a lot of information that was deemed to be pretty useful for the state and for the court. And they did European tours, and it was like sort of a cross between Bon Jovi and the Rolling Stones turning up. Thousands of people went to see these guys. Thousands of them. John Dee was the original 007. He was the most, Queen Elizabeth gave him the number 007. That's where Ian Fleming got it from. He was a spy as well, so was Kelly. They were really interested in encryption, and they were really interested in magic numbers and magic squares. So the chances are, whilst they were doing these kind of psychic tours of Europe and really wowing the crowds and probably pulling in shed loads of cash as well, they were also spying for the state. What an exciting life it must have been. It's amazing the guy bloody survived at all, to tell you the truth. He did survive. Eventually, I mean, I think Elizabeth sacked him actually, I can't remember why. And he ended up living at home with Mother. But once he got home with Mother, he built the biggest what was then the biggest library in Europe, all on his own. Actually, in a recent history of pagan witchcraft, well actually, recent, it's probably 10 or 12 years old now, a book called Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton. He actually says that if you look through Dee's works, there is no evidence of a system of magic there. It's just that John Dee invented a language called Enochian, after Enoch, you know, the guy from the non-canonical books, and that Enochian was the language used by Aleister Crowley's demiurges and demigods in his spells and rituals. So in a way, Dee's reputation for being able to pull off heavy magic is because his language is associated with Crowley. So there's a lot of strange stuff about John Dee. It's not all that he appears to be, necessarily. So that's a few of your main alchemists. We can see, you probably can see already, that they've been involved in many things. Alchemy kind of changed over time, but it always remained largely associated with laboratory procedures or the procedures of transformation. It's associated with activities that are possibly of divine origin and are certainly divinely informed from those original days way back in Egypt and probably before that. The alchemist's work always has an inner and an outer aspect. He's a dealer in dirt, who nonetheless, like I said earlier, is dealing with the same subjects as poets and artists, and is seen as travelling on the same kind of parabola with them. And the work's tightly bound up with the process of nature. Over time, the alchemists involved themselves with philosophy, medicine, metallurgy, dyeing and dyes, chemistry, astronomy, logic, warfare, botany, optics, maths, theatre. They were everywhere. Everywhere where there was an edge, there was an alchemist. Alchemy might have come from Egypt, or to Egypt, like so many other things did, from Sumer, which is supposed to be the land that was given birth to civilization. And I talk a bit about Sumer in the history talk. It's where many of the things, accountancy, teaching, schools, wheels, alloys, the working of gold, loads of things started in Sumer, and it's assumed really that that's where alchemy came from as well. And interestingly, Maynard Keynes is a bit of a modern miracle brain. He described Isaac Newton, who was born only 50 years or so after Shakespeare's death, as the last of the Babylonian and Sumerian magi. So you see what's happening there? This guy, Maynard Keynes, says that effectively Isaac Newton was one of the Babylonian and Sumerian magi, one of the guys way back from the dawn of science, the dawn of writing, the dawn of civilization, and that process went all the way up to the founding of modern science with Isaac Newton. So as far as Keynes is concerned, Isaac Newton sort of spans the whole era, the whole sort of 5,000 years in which alchemy was being written about. I think it's quite ironic that Isaac Newton, who obviously evidently understood the oneness of everything and the interrelatedness of it all, should somehow have been deemed to have fathered a scientific paradigm which splits everything away from everything else and is regarded by many people as actually threatening the forces of nature herself. It's amazing that he knew one thing and has been projected to us as something completely different. I smell a rat. So I've said that a lot of alchemical metaphors and things are common to us because we hear about the legends. Remember the Mad King and all of that, and the Young King. That's one of them that resurfaces again and again. Another one that we'll all be familiar with here is the idea of a king or a champion dying and being interred under the earth or in a cave, and then staying there for 3 days, and then rising from the dead, or the bones of the old king being removed, or the spirit of the old king moving into the young king. All of these things are kind of associated. We see it in the Jesus myth, but I'm sure that you've all seen Zeitgeist and know that the Jesus myth is only a modern rendition of something that has been happening for a long time. So there are 25, 26 key points that connect Catholicism as it's practiced now in the church today with the Assyrian religion, the religion of Osiris and Horus. So these things are kind of, they're throughout the world, this idea that somebody can get buried and 3 days rise again, and that somehow the world, or the champion, or the king, or whatever, is reborn as a result of that. And it's believed that this is a model in stone of that particular myth. This is a megalithic structure at Newgrange in a valley in Ireland. It was built over 5,200 years ago, so about 3,200 BC. After more than 5 millennia, this structure is still watertight. There's a tunnel that runs in through this gap here, and it runs into the heart of the structure where there's a chamber. And it's still been cunningly enough contrived to hide the chamber at the end and the tunnel of the scattered light of the early dawn. And here we can see a close-up of the entrance. This is where the humans get in, and this is where the light comes in on the December solstice every year. The morning of the winter solstice sun. What's particularly interesting about this site is that every 8 years or so, it also picks up the light of Venus as it rises 15 minutes before the sun. It's called the heliacal rising of Venus. If you look at this, you can see that the tunnel is actually slightly snaky shaped. Can you see that it's not straight, that it's actually slightly wobbly? Also, rather interestingly, it kind of rises, it's on a gentle slope. Now, the people that built this, and that massive structure has got quartz all the way around it, it's got some of the hardest granite that we've got, really difficult to work. 250,000 tonnes of washed river cobbles are in there. It's an amazing amount of work, and they've built several of these things before. And this time, all of the others had straight passages on them. And what they're effectively doing here is they're making the beam of Venus into like coherent light. They're actually forcing it, constricting it down the tunnel. Now, my friend Mick the Moon, who makes the blue moon calendars with the silver moons on it, and runs my Dr. Rock website and my Mayan date calculators and everything, one of the things he's done is he's written a piece of software which allows you to push the stars backwards and forwards in time. And he was a bit suspicious about the fact that Newgrange was picking up Venus every 8 years. He didn't seem right, and I trust Mick. I'm not a scientist, he is. He's the one who pricks my bubble and keeps me on line. Anyway, we sat down, we ran his software, and you can see that actually Venus does do this thing where it moves around and it will return to the same place in the night sky now as it was doing 5,200 years ago. Completely astonishing thing for it to be doing, and if it surprises Mick, really honestly, if it surprises Mick, it is a surprising thing. So the idea is that on the winter solstice, 1 year in every 8, Venus will rise and it will send this kind of ghostly grey light all the way down here, and it will light the chamber in the grey light of dawn. And remember, she's the symbol of new life and new birth. And as she shines along the entrance corridor and illuminates the inside of the chamber, 15 minutes before the rising of the sun, brightens the barrow to gold. And there's a picture of it shining down the corridor and eventually into the chamber at the end. Really clever trick. We've actually got one of these up on Anglesey in Wales called Bryn Celli D, which is another winter solstice one. It's got a beam splitter in it. It's actually got a prism at the end, so that when the solstice sun rises, and the winter solstice in Wales, once every 150 years or so, you actually get to see this chamber, which couldn't be lit otherwise, lit by sun which splits through this. So this is like a version of the same thing. But of course, in this, as this happens, effectively a new day, and in the old calendar, as the days start getting longer, a new year is born. One possible explanation for the complexity of all of this is that the Newgrange structure is a means of resurrecting symbolically the old king. The idea that you're kind of, any of your spring equinox celebrations, women who've become pregnant during the spring celebrations would give birth sometime around the winter solstice. So the idea is that at some point when it was known they were on the right year for the Venus to be doing her thing, they would move either the woman who was pregnant to have the baby, but more likely the young child and the mother would go in there. And the idea is that symbolically, the spirit of the old king, represented by Venus and the grey light, is transferred into the new king and the new consciousness and the new year, and the new arising is represented by the rising of the solstice sun. And all of that has been kind of built, if you like, into this stone structure. An amazing thing to have done. Capturing Venus. How did they do that? It's an amazing thing to have pointed this bloody massive structure. It's got a huge single cantilevered stone over the chamber, which meets up with the tunnel so accurately that no water gets through. Even though the guys had no metal, the stone is grooved so that the water runs away from the chamber and it runs into the barrow surrounding it. It's an absolutely astonishing structure, really. But most of all, if they could do this with the light of Venus every 8 years, they knew another really important secret, one that was familiar to the Maya, the Babylonians, many other ancient stargazers. This is what Venus does in our night sky. Every 8 years, she forms a perfect pentagram above the Earth. And this, of course, is another really important symbol that we didn't go into. It's called the Goblin's Cross, or the Witch's Foot. And it's imagined to be earth, air, fire, water, and ether. And then in the middle, you've got a sixth element that is hidden, another pentagram, which is thought to be love. But obviously, in order to build a thing that picks this up, you have to know that that's what Venus is doing. This suggests really quite a sophisticated point of view. And these guys have no lenses at all. These are called the grooved ware people. They're probably responsible for all of the megalithic sites in Northern Europe and the UK. And they obviously knew about this, and they knew about this without lenses. Also, it's said that this rose, the Wars of the Roses, remember the white roses and the red roses, they're all supposed to be associated with this same symmetry. And make no mistake, Shakespeare was an alchemist and he was a shaman. Shakespeare understood all of this stuff, and the more you get to know his plays, the more of this stuff you get to find kind of hidden within it. Also, the thing I like about this, of course, is we've got a star, a cave, a miraculous rebirth that's timed so carefully you'd need Magi to predict it. And as it happens, every 8 years that this thing goes, the first year, one of the years it would have done it would have been 1 AD, just after the nominal birth of the Saviour. And people do wonder why they put his birth where it is when it was actually 3 years later. And I'm wondering whether there isn't a connection between the actual precise timing of this and the timing of the arrival of the Messiah. It's just an interesting thought. So, alchemy saw connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena. Modern physics is just starting to catch up with that. Modern physics also recognises that the observer's role is vital in the outcome of any experiment, and that the observer, the observed, and the observing apparatus are all one thing. Alchemy, as many other esoteric strands, propose that matter can be manipulated through strong visual imagination. So your actual involvement with the experiment and your visualisation of it was one of the things that was changing it. Then, actually, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanical theory suggests that everything exists in this kind of vibrating state of might-be-ness or everythingness until it encounters consciousness, and then it becomes isness. It becomes something that actually happens. The waveform collapses, and when consciousness meets something, it becomes the thing that consciousness is looking at. And the alchemists were already beginning to understand that sort of thing. If we return just for a minute to the Ouroboros, a reminder that it's a representative of the eternal cycle of nature. It's recreating itself by feeding on its own body, which is a symbol of matter transformed, and so of alchemy itself. And my mother's a brilliant example of somebody who doesn't really quite understand this system. She really likes feeding the birds and stuff, and she enjoys watching it all. But if a sparrowhawk comes down and has one of the little songbirds, she gets really upset. But that is nature feeding on its own body. Every spring we see all these cute, shiny little critters and birds and mice and all the rest of it, millions of them. Well, 99.99% of them are going to get eaten by the 0.1% that are due to get bigger and breed and provide the 99% that are going to get eaten next year. Nature is constantly renewing itself by feeding on its own body.
Do you think that's of itself?
No, it's the way everything works. Our problem is that we don't recognise that we regard ourselves as permanent and particularly significant in things, whereas our rising and our falling away is part of the cycle. So their idea was to do quite the opposite, to say that it's not a sin. It is the way things go, and you shouldn't be letting people kind of hassle.
No, thinking of the full stories of eating, Joseph Campbell,
Yeah, so right, yes, the sacrifice and the mass.
Yeah, and just eating, the process of, Joseph Campbell says, look at the birds, they're pecking, they're eating. The cows are grazing, they're eating. In order to live, we have to eat.
Yeah.
And so it's that circle of
yes, indeed, taking
so
and
it
eating.
is that sacrifice of yourself, really,
Yeah.
in order to perpetuate.
In the old hunting societies, in the Mayan society, hunting is represented by a hand like on the end of a scorpion's tail, and it's the hand of the hunter, the hand of the accomplishment of life. And in their myths, what happens is when you're going hunting, your eyes will meet the eyes of an animal in the herd, and it will offer itself to you. So hunting isn't a matter of one thing mercilessly hunting down another, it's more of a dance of co-creation. Exactly that. Exactly, the matter transformed, that you're dancing with the deer. And the only thing, the hunter that's dancing like that will realise that eventually he too is going to go the way of the deer, that's part of the dance and part of the swap. And Joseph Campbell is particularly strong on that subject, on the hunting of the buffalo and those amazing buffalo myths about how you can dance people and beasties back to life. But all of that stuff is in this symbol. That was, I think, quite a useful little divergence there, because it gives you some idea of the colour that this image throws over the whole planet. And what happened, the reason why I bring this up again is because one of the most boring things I read for this talk was the gold bulletin number 18 about the importance of gold in alchemy, and it was dreary. And at the very end of it, the guy had done this, he's put a picture of a nuclear fusion toroid and described it as a modern Ouroboros. I thought, wow, that's amazing, because these nuclear reactors, they do kind of eat their own tail once you've got them going. And most of all, the reason why this picture ended up out of the boring article is because the very next thing I picked up was these two. This is from the amazing Little Book of Coincidence, one of the little wooden books. Is everybody familiar with wooden books? It's an imprint. They're all little square brown books. They're all printed on recycled material. Wooden Books is the name of the imprint, and they do all ancient knowledge. They do lots. They do this Little Book of Coincidence, Archimedean and Platonic Solids, Harmonograph, Hedgerow Cookbook, Labyrinths, Crop Circles, loads of stuff. They are really, really brilliant. And this Little Book of Coincidence maps a lot of really interesting things that the planets do around us. This one, I'll show a bigger picture of it in a minute. It's got Earth in the middle, Jupiter there, and Saturn on the outside. And I was really struck by how much this kind of solar system diagram looked like these physicists in the middle of their nuclear fusion toroid. And the thing about this is that you've got Earth in the middle, and this is what Jupiter looks like it's doing as it travels around us in the night sky. Every now and then, is everybody familiar that sometimes the planets go retrograde and they look to be travelling backwards in the night sky? Well, that's what these loops represent. That's when something seems to be going like that. So Jupiter goes like this through our night sky. And if you were on Jupiter, Earth would do exactly that in the sky. If you're on Saturn, if you're standing on Earth looking at Saturn, Saturn does this. And if you were on Saturn, Earth would do that in the night sky. Now, as well as looking like a nuclear fusion toroid, the important thing to recognise about these is that they finish up in a slightly different place. So you can see that the next round of these is going to end up being slightly beside the one that occurred before. Same with this one. Most of the people in this room will be familiar with the old spirograph toy, where you could draw these kind of like what look like a paper body. Well, that's what's happening in the night sky. Now, every pair of planets has got this dance. So Earth and all the other planets have got these different shapes, and they all start in a slightly different place. And yet Venus is still shining right up that Newgrange tunnel after 5,200 years of this drift. So even though all these stars are drifting and everything, and we're all moving, things are never happening the same again, we know that, it's all moving it on, somehow our solar system seems to be in a state of stasis in motion. All of this drifting, it's like we're here at a special time. I'm not sure that Venus will always shine up that tunnel, for example. But over these 5,200 years it has done. These 5,200 years covered by the Mayan calendar, as we understand it today. So there's a bit of stuff about the Ouroboros and the modern view of it. What about alchemy today? Is there anybody practicing alchemy today? Last time I did the alchemy talk, I had this book brought to my attention, The Elixir of Immortality, a modern day alchemist's discovery of the Philosopher's Stone. I haven't managed to get hold of a copy of it yet, but I am told that it is really like the book to have, in terms of not only dealing with Western alchemy, the alchemy we're dealing with here, but also dealing with Arabian alchemy and Chinese alchemy, which are really different things, especially the Chinese. But that book tells you how they're all singing from the same hymn sheet, how there appears to be a common source. The modern alchemist that I came across is somebody that I already knew about. I was quite pleased when 14 Times published an article about him. His name's Art Kunking. Some of us will remember him as the self-confessed, self-styled king of the hippies in LA in the 60s. He was the founder of the Los Angeles Free Press, which was a seriously radical publication. He also took the whole of the Los Angeles narcotics department to court and gave them a run for their money. He's also doing alchemy. www.alchemyrevealed.com gives you some idea of what he's getting at. And he's also now got a biography, which I hadn't heard about, but the same person that recommended that book tells me that Art Kunkins is worth reading as well. Now, he thinks, he's more or less 100% certain that he has found the elixir of life. And there's no boiling of pus or processing of the wild imagination or anything like that. He reckons that the important thing is the lesser matter. What is your lesser matter? Now, you remember how we described it as worthless and vile and despised by all men and everywhere present. Most things that are everywhere present are despised by all men anyway. Well, Kunking reckons that this description matches an isotope, a radioactive isotope called pitchblende. Pitchblende with an E at the end of it. is a byproduct of the mining of gold and silver, and it looks like a normal rock. So you see how it would be vile and unregarded by everybody? If you're looking for gold and silver, this stuff is just getting in your way. You would just chuck it out of the way. Now, he says that the other thing about pitchblende, as well as it being a byproduct of mining, is that it has what he calls non-ionising radiation. It gives off non-ionising radiation. Now, I don't know what that phrase means, and Mick, my scientific bubble pricker, tells me that it is the wrong phrase. But what kunking means is that there's radiation that can be given off by some stones that do not make you sick. But what they do is they encourage action in other things that are around them. And I believe that one of the schools of thought for the arising of life on Earth, the one that doesn't believe in something coming from space and setting it off, believes that these kind of items like pitchblende, just by sitting there gently being warm and giving off beta radiation, slowly but surely kicked organic life into growth. And that's what Kunkin believes. He says this radiation's all around us, whatever it's called, mostly from the sun, but radiation is possibly how life originally developed, from energy in inorganic materials, which is remarkably similar to what the alchemists were saying. This idea of the dull becoming shiny, as we were talking about earlier. Actually, it tends to go the other way around. Over time, the shiny becomes dull. So you get really complicated isotopes, which over time on the moon have all become lead. The moon's covered in lead because it used to be covered in much more interesting stuff. Anyway, this guy reckons that he's found the elixir of life, and what this is quite simply no experimentation, no arsing about necessary, just put pears in a jar with pitchblende and eat the pears. And he says that he can now stay out of bed for 48, 56 hours on the chop without food, beavering away at his computer. You go, well, was it worth it? You know? Yes, it's funny, isn't it, the way he does it. So he says the principle of life is in the mineral kingdom, and he believes that minerals are really alive and evolve one into the other, just like the alchemists said. He reckons that if you can attract the life principle from a mineral, then you can change one metal into another, and through a transmutation make it into a medicine which makes the human being last longer. And he is not alone in this. There's other people who say this. There are museums that contain alchemical gold, gold that was not mined and has a different specific gravity. There are objects made of this stuff and nobody can explain it. Now, I'm not quite sure about specific gravity in terms of gold and just exactly what that means, but I do know that there's different sorts of iron on Earth and that they have different specific gravities, that they are both iron, but some of them come from Earth and some of them, like the iron that's in the Great Pyramid, come from space. And the difference between the two ions is a difference in specific gravity, okay? Same stuff. Well, I think that makes Kunkin's argument that there's two different sorts of gold, you know, reasonably acceptable. But what makes it really acceptable to me is the fact that the British Museum, in their coins and medals department, have got a piece of gold which they say quite clearly on its label is of alchemical origin. So it's good enough for the British Museum, it's good enough for me. They never lie about anything. So that's about the end. Having proved to you that gold can be made out of other things, and that, you know, people are around eating pears and living longer and staying awake longer as a result. That's about the end of the introduction to alchemy. I'll just leave you with a picture that has got lots and lots and lots of alchemical symbols in them, all of which should now be familiar to you. And lots and lots of things. And that's about it, really. That picture's called Immortality. It is, and it's got lots of things in it. So, thank you very much for your time. Before I take any questions, anybody who wishes to have copies of the notes for the talk, or who wishes to be kept in touch with all the stuff that I'm doing either here or in other places, put your name and email address on here, and I'll either send you the notes and probably remind you of things that I'm doing. Please write your email address in capital letters. A, because then I can read it, and B, because your email address works if you put it in capital letters. The only reason they told you to put it in lowercase letters is so that we can't read each other's email addresses. So there's that. And another thing, any of you that are interested in hearing some of my thoughts on sacred geometry and can't wait till I come back here to do it again, there's a little DVD here which is a 90-minute interview with me talking about sacred geometry and many, many other things besides. It's only a £5, so one of you could buy it and share it out amongst yourselves, or copy it and give it to each other. But there'll never be another one like this. This is the first time I was interviewed, so I was thoroughly relaxed and didn't realise there was a difference between talking to a guy with a DVD on and talking to people down the pub. So there's stuff on there that I probably wouldn't necessarily say when I'm being recorded. So whatever it is, there's never going to be anything quite like it. It's also got a correction sticker on the back, so the rubbish I talk on it is actually put right. Thank you very much. You're great. Questions?
I've just got a couple. At the beginning you said the history of the giants, the married spirits, the Nephilim married spirits. I thought the Nephilim mated with human beings.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, indeed.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's what it says in. That's what it says in the Bible. It says in the Bible that that these creatures looked on the daughters of men and saw that they were good and had sex with them and had babies with them. That's
So
what
what's
it
the
says.
spirits?
It is in the legend about the history of alchemy. Yeah, you have to remember that it's what we're talking. It's really difficult to sort historical reference from historical fact here.
Yeah.
It's a slight difference, really. Same gist though. What I'm saying is that you'll find different versions of that story depending on where you look, but the story is probably basically sound.
Just another couple. Right, you said St. John, the Knights of St. John, they're Illuminati group, aren't they?
Almost for sure. I'd say from the amount of bleeding money they were getting and what they were doing, they were,
Yeah, because they take all the money off everybody,
Yeah.
don't they?
I tend to call them the world management team.
World management team. I was just going to say, because I've only read that in a Barbara Cahan Cloud book.
Right.
World management
Oh,
team.
is that where it came from? I was wondering.
Well, she's supposed to be channeled, wasn't she, stuff?
Yeah.
And the world management team was how she described the people who run the planet.
Right, yeah, it's how I call.
It's
Yeah.
the same people, isn't it?
I think it's the same people. We could call them the dark power holders. We could call them what we like.
Do you think there might be a connection between monatomic gold and the philosophers?
Most definitely, yeah, definitely, because there's this business of the fact that it gets lighter than nothing at some point during the process. So yes, I think there's a connection between monatomic gold and the albedo, the white gold, and Saqqara and the pyramids and all of that. They found tons and tons, well, not tons because it doesn't weigh a lot. And Saqqara, Flinders Petrie, when he got there, he found roomful upon roomful of this unbelievable white dust, and they don't know what it is. But they do think it's some kind of side effect of the production of white gold, which is also thought to be something to do with the transference of the pharaohs physically from this realm into the other realm that they're talking about in the pyramid texts.
Do you think there's any truth, in the claim of its health benefits?
I suspect there probably is in that as well, just because it's high frequency stuff.
Yeah.
High frequency stuff is when our frequencies are being deliberately depressed, it seems to me. I've used monatomic gold and I swear you can almost feel yourself being lifted by it. Hardly any of it at all. And also we did some muscle testing, we did some kinesiology on its effectiveness, and it seemed to be working on us, certainly. Yes, sir? Yep.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
I'm going to put this in context. 16 years ago, I read a book once because I had to, because it was on a particular reading list. It was called The Elizabethan World View and the Great Chain of Being. Now, you touched on when you said the Great Chain.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's
what it would be, yeah, indeed.
Right.
Now, can we write the name of that down before I lose it? Because I'd like to.
Yeah, because I've just forgotten what
Yeah.
I just said. I think it's the Elizabethan World View and the Great Chain of Being. There was a political element to that notion of, as you said, almost Darwinism, that everything was interlinked between each other. There was also a political and social element to that being put into everyday life and responsibilities between kings and queens. That's leading to, did the alchemists ever get involved in politics? Because in your talk, they don't appear to have done, other than trying to make a bit of money.
I don't think they did. I mean, instinctively, my assumption is that they were all making energetic progress in the other direction from the politicians.
Right.
That's what I feel.
I
And
didn't
also,
see that at all.
didn't you? I don't think the politicians.
Because it was very much a folklore time, and there was a huge change with the medical profession. Suddenly, it was the trendy thing for men to go into the medical profession and scientific research.
And up till then,
doing
women
all
have
that.
been doing all that kind of
Of
work,
course, so
haven't they?
it was sort of like moving that power shift. And also there was a thing going on with the church, where the church were trying to, the way that how people saw disease was that they were possessed of demons, or
Yeah.
so
And
they
of
were
course,
trying to change all that.
Paracelsus was the first
Yeah.
one to change that. He
Yeah.
was literally the first one to take it out of the laboratory and say, she hasn't got demons, she needs some more iron,
Yeah.
you know, or whatever.
Or she needs to be have a hole drilled in her head.
Yes, yeah. And that's still going on, of course.
Yeah.
Really, the same thing's still happening. You can go to the GP or you can go to someone who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, can you just say paraclesis? Just say, wait, because you spent all that time. There's paraclesis guy, right? So you said holistic fella, homeopathic.
Yes,
he
he's-
said he
he's-
went into allopathic.
Well, he's got the official moniker of the father of holistic medicine because
Yeah.
of his tendency to treat the whole person. But he was also one of the first people to take elements from the outside and change the inside by putting them in people. Up until then, medicine was quite a lot to do with bleeding and leeches and operations, and it didn't seem to have occurred to at least many people, possibly not anybody at all, that you can rebalance the inside by putting something in from outside. And that, of course, is fundamentally your allopathic approach. It's also the homeopathic approach, of course, but I don't want to split hairs.
Steve, you mentioned that a lot of the alchemists were in the Catholic Church.
Priests, yeah,
Priests,
they'll, yeah,
monks,
yeah.
whatever. Do you think that the Catholic Church, do you think they were doing their own research into this and were just trying to suppress the people that were publicising it? Or
Yeah,
do you think they
definitely,
were narrow-minded?
No, I think not. I mean, the evidence is that the Catholic Church has got some of the most advanced scientific laboratories and observatories in the world nowadays, and there's no reason to believe it was any different then.
Do you think it came originally from Rome then?
No, I think it
No.
came from Atlantis.
Well,
Yeah, you know, they buy Atlantis. I mean,
Atlantis,
that's a name that John Michel uses. I mean, obviously Atlantis has got several different meanings. Plato wrote about the sinking of an island and the sinking of the loss of the continent and all of that. John Michel uses it to refer to a numerate culture sometime in our dim and distant past that is expressing itself in the geometries that are apparent in the Earth today. So, yeah, when I say Atlantis, I mean someone, effectively, the whole of humanity was wiped out by a flood, just like it says in the Bible. And before that flood, they were as sophisticated as we are. And that what we're looking at through the alchemists and through geometers and one or two other people is the remnants of this knowledge. So I think that, and Egypt seemed to have inherited a lot of that knowledge somehow, and still looking into the difference between Sumer and Egypt. Orthodoxy says that Sumer invented civilization and that Egypt learnt off Sumer, that Egypt came after Sumer. Sumer started 5,400 BC developing, and that Egypt became a state 3114 BC. Well, looking at the two states, I'd say they developed more or less independently. I think something happened in Egypt at the same time as it happened in Sumer, and they developed two very different systems of dealing with their expanding populations. But the knowledge, this ancient numerate knowledge, was apparent, I believe, in both of those societies, independently.
Would you believe then that Atlantis went under the seas, and when Atlantis went under the seas, it went into Egypt?
I think the remains there. I think
Some
the
people
remains.
escaped.
Some people did seem to escape, yes, indeed, which is what's represented by Noah and his boat. There's other, and that's an ancient legend that comes up again and again. Before Noah, we had Ziusudra in Babylon, and what's his name, Utanapishtim. Before Utanapishtim, we had Ziusudra. So that name goes back and back, and the idea of a boat with all the animals and the family of people on it and all of that. But that's one version of the survival story, isn't it? We should all be aware that throughout the globe there's stories of tall white men with beards coming out of the west in reed boats. Again, survival possibly from Atlantis. Or again, the idea that people walked into other places through underground tunnels, especially in South America that applies. So all of those is this idea that Atlantis or Lemuria, whatever it is, was going down, and that the wise people knew it was. They could tell that sewing donkeys' dongers onto the men and stuff was not actually going to take you any further forward. And people were saying, you know, you're going down. We've got to develop resilience. We've got to do something about the state of the world in which we find ourselves. And eventually it collapses, and some people are just listening, and some people get out. But I think that the Noah and the white men in boats and the guys walking out of tunnels are all memories of the same thing. It's just that it occurred slightly differently in different places. And of course we might not have just lost one culture. It might be that the Lemuria, say, was an issue of mind, and a lot of things was being created with mind and with logic, like Aristotle did. And maybe that went down and we bloody lost absolutely everything. And then Atlantis arose, and then we lost that. And now we've got this. And now most of all, I don't know what you feel, but I look at a lot of what's going on today, and what keeps jumping into my mind is, Jesus, it feels like we've been here before.
Yeah.
You know, and we're just that, like a hair's breadth away from the whole thing going over again. But the important thing to remember is that the shamanic guys who are doing prophecies about this time are saying that we're about to enter a golden age. But this is amongst all of them. We could still screw it up. They are evidently nervous about the state of the world, and who can blame them? But the tale is, the prophecy is, that this time we're not going to do that. This time we're not going to crash and burn. This time we're not going to forget just because we die. One of the most important things to remember is not to be frightened. The only thing we've got to be frightened of is fear itself. We need to believe that we're not going to collapse. We're the best there's ever been. We're the ones we've been waiting for. So this time, we're about to enter an age of 26,000 years or so of waking up after 5,000 years ago.
Beginning of a new era, new age.
New paradigm.
2012 been ending.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's this is one of the interesting things. The Mayan calendar is due to the end of time, is what they call it, which is better than the end of the world, because time, they're talking about the time that's enslaved us. Their cycle started in 3114 BC in August, which was broadly the same time as Egypt came together as a single state, and is broadly the time that civilization reached its full power in Sumer. And what it is this 5,200 year period is 1/5 of a 26,000 year period, okay? And the 26,000 year period is the amount of time it takes the Earth's celestial pole to work slowly backwards through all the signs of the zodiac. Okay?
Precession of the equinox.
Precession of the equinox.
Could you
So
tell me?
We're about to go into the age of Aquarius from the age of Pisces. And
Now
go
to
into
the
Pisces.
golden age.
Yeah, Pisces from Aries, Aries from Taurus, and all of that. Well, these last 5,200 years, the Maya, I'm sure, saw the arising of all of these things, of laws, of wars, of emperors, of people killing and murdering and all of that, because it wasn't going on. We can see from the archaeological record, and do come to the history talk when it's on, we can see that until that point it didn't happen. Yes, sir.
Could you tell me the name of that picture? So
Yes,
I can
it's called
Google it.
Immortality.
Immortality,
Yeah,
thank you.
but I
You
can't
did say
remember-
actually,
yeah, I
yeah,
can't
thanks very
remember
much.
who did it.
Yeah, cheers.
Very good. Everybody happy? Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.